The ballroom holds 300 people, and one woman standing very still near the bar, 40 years old, fitted black dress, both hands wrapped around a champagne flute she hasn't touched. She's been asking questions all evening, not about the children, about the voting shares. Backstage, a man in a dark suit reads a name off an award plaque he hasn't fully processed yet. 4 teenagers are standing behind him.
Old 18. Old is up. Built to the Tuesday mornings.
Med lab sessions, and every ordinary day he refused to quit. He already knows she's here. So do they. The orchestra plays on. The chandeliers throw light across 600 square feet of marble floor. Somewhere in the crowd, a young woman pressed record on a device she's carried for 12 years. She never deleted the file. Tonight, everyone finds out why. Darius Wells knew how to make 4 lunches at the same time. Sounds small. It wasn't. 4 sandwiches. 4 juice boxes. 4 bags of chips sorted by preference because Ezra didn't like the orange ones. Theo wouldn't touch anything barbecue. Jade wanted exactly 12 chips and she would count them, and Zara ate whatever was left, but only if you asked her what she wanted first. 6 years old. All 4 of them. Born 11 minutes apart on a Tuesday morning that Darius still remembered in pieces. The smell of the hospital hallway, the way his hands shook signing paperwork, Simone laughing through tears when the nurse said, "And there's another one." 4 times over. He stood at the counter that Tuesday morning and did what he always did. Radio low, coffee going. Morning light coming through the kitju at the angle that made the whole room look like something out of a magazine neither of them ever subscribed to. It was the kind of morning that felt permanent. That was the thing about that morning. It felt like something that would always exist, like it had always existed. Like he and Simone on the 4 kids and the juice boxes and the orange chips Ezra didn't like were just facts of the universe. Settled things, done things. He would think about that later, how ordinary it looked, how solid, how none of it was. Simone came through the kitchen in a fitted burgundy dress, heels already on, silk press swinging past her collarbone. She was beautiful the way some women are beautiful without trying. Effortlessly, almost accidentally. The kind of face that made strangers look twice and then feel embarrassed about it. She kissed him on the cheek, grabbed her coffee, said she'd be late. He said okay. That was their Tuesday morning. By Tuesday night, it was the last normal thing he could remember. The baths took 45 minutes. They always did. Ezra wanted bubbles. Theo didn't. Jade screamed when water got in her eyes, even with a washcloth over her face, which defeated the purpose of the washcloth entirely. Zara sat in the tub reciting the names of every dinosaur she knew, which was 14 dinosaurs, and she named every single one in the correct order, every single time, because that was Zara. Darius read the dinosaur book 3 times. Not because he wanted to, because nobody could agree on a different one, and 3 rounds of the dinosaur book was still fast and the argument that started whenever he tried to close it after 2. He tucked them in. 4 small bodies in 2 bunk beds he'd built himself out of pine from the lumberyard on Roosevelt Road. Ezra flung one arm over the side, already halfway asleep and still somehow standing guard. Theo kicked his blanket to the foot of the bed before Darius even made it to the door. Jade and Zara shared the bottom bunk, hands almost touching in the middle without either of them reaching. He stood in the doorway a moment, just a moment. Then he walked down the hall to the kitchen expecting to find Simone at the sink. The sink was empty. The kitchen was quiet. And on the table, propped against the napkin holder, was a piece of paper folded in quarters. Her wedding ring sat beside it. He didn't pick either of them up right away. He just stood there, refrigerator humming. Someone's car passing slow on the street outside, his own breathing going somewhere between normal and something else entirely. Then he unfolded the paper. 4 sentences. Simone said she needed more than this life could give her. She said the children would be better off without the tension. She said she was sorry. The 4th sentence was not an apology. The 4th sentence was a period at the end of something that apparently had a beginning and a middle he hadn't been told about. He set the paper down, picked up his phone. Not to call anyone. He wasn't ready to call anyone. He opened his banking app the way some men check the news when they don't know what else to do with their hands. Habit. That was all. Or that's what he told himself right before the screen loaded. The transfer was 7 days old, $200. Gone from their joint account, routed to an account under Simone's name alone. labeled in the memo field with 2 words, consulting retainer. 7 days, not 7 hours, not some decision she'd made after an argument that morning, not a breaking point she'd finally reached. 7 days ago, while he was giving baths and reading about dinosaurs and making lunches and signing school permission slips, Simone had already moved money out of their shared account and into one he hadn't known existed. She had been planning this. He sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't feel rage first. He knew people expected rage first. Maybe some part of him expected it too. But rage wasn't what came. What came was quieter than that. Colder, the specific recognition. No, not specific. That was the wrong word. The recognition. Just the recognition. Of standing on ground you believed was solid and understanding, without ceremony, that it had been hollow underneath you for a while. That you were the only person in the house who hadn't known. He got up once, walked back to the kids' room, stood in the doorway again. 4 small bodies, breathing slow and even in the dark. Ezra's arm over the side. Theo's blanket already kicked free. Jade and Zara's hands almost touching. He stood there until the hallway light felt less like light and more like something he was holding on to. Then the tears came. Quiet ones. The kind a man learns to produce without sound, because somewhere down the hall, 4 children needed him to look steady in the morning, and the morning was only a few hours away. He went back to the kitchen, sat at the table until sunrise, stared at a wedding ring that no longer meant what he had understood it to mean, wondering specifically how long she had been planning to leave it behind. The knock came at 9 the next morning. He'd had maybe 90 minutes of sleep in the chair. The kids were up, fed, dressed, asking where Mama was. He told them she went on a work trip. Theo asked if she took her dinosaur book. Darius said no. Theo seemed satisfied with that. He was pouring a second cup of coffee when the knock came. Aunt Dolores, 58 years old. Simone's mother's older sister. The kind of woman who arrived at family dinners 45 minutes early and spent the time rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. She had Rochelle with her. Simone's best friend since college. 27 years old, phone already in hand, not quite looking at anything. They sat down without being invited to sit. That was the first sign. Dolores folded her hands on the table, the same table where the note had been 12 hours ago. She looked at Darius with an expression he could only describe as prepared. Like she'd rehearsed this. Like she knew exactly what she was going to say and had already decided how it would end. "We're worried," she said. "About the children." Darius put his coffee down. "Simone has concerns," Dolores continued, "about your ability to manage 4 children on your own. The hours you work, the research schedule. She feels they need a more stable primary environment." She said it the way someone reads from a document. Because she was reading from a document, not literally, but the words had that quality, that pre-sorted quality. Nothing spontaneous. Nothing that belonged to this specific morning in this specific kitchen. Rochelle hadn't looked up from her phone. Darius sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "I appreciate you coming by." That was all. He walked them to the door, closed it, stood in the hallway. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney. Not because he was panicking. Because he understood something now that he hadn't understood at 9 the previous evening. Simone hadn't just left. She'd filed the paperwork in her head before she walked out the door. The note was the last step, not the first. And the visit from Dolores, the concern about stability, the 4 children, the hours he worked, that was the next step. He was already in the middle of something. He just hadn't known it was starting. 3 weeks passed. Darius ran the mornings on pure routine. Wake, coffee, lunches, 4 different preferences, 12 chips for Jade. Drop off, research lab, pickup, dinner, baths, books, bed. Then the night shift, papers, emails, whatever the lab needed that couldn't wait until morning. He didn't talk about Simone to anyone except his attorney. He told the kids she was still traveling. He hated saying it. He said it anyway because they were 6, and the truth was a building under construction, and he wasn't ready to let them walk through it yet. 3 weeks in, his phone rang. The IT director from the university where he ran his research lab, a man named Gerald. Careful voice. The kind voice people use when they're about to tell you something they've double-checked twice because they didn't believe it the first time either. "We flagged something in a routine audit," Gerald said. "Outgoing access to your restricted research files. The compound delivery project. The unpublished work." Darius went still. The access was under your wife's credentials, Gerald said. Simone Wells. Her university guest login. When? 7 months ago, and twice after that, 7 months ago. He did the math without wanting to. 7 months ago, Simone had been sleeping in the same bed, making coffee, asking him about his research over dinner the way she always did, because for 6 years he had told her about most of his work. Because he'd never once thought about where that information went after it left the dinner table. She hadn't accessed his files after a fight. She hadn't done it in some moment of desperation or confusion. She had done it with a login, deliberately, at a time he couldn't point to on a calendar because there was nothing on that day to point to. It was just a regular day that he couldn't remember anymore, lost somewhere in the ordinary weight of 4 children, and a research project and a marriage he had believed in. He thanked Gerald, hung up, sat in his car in the university parking lot for a long time. Then he called Kelvin Nash. They'd known each other since their first year of graduate school. Kelvin had lasted 2 semesters before deciding academic research wasn't the thing and pivoting hard into something else entirely. Private investigation of all the pivots available. He was good at it. He was good at it the way some people are good at things that require patience and an ability to watch without being seen. I need you to look at something, Darius said. Yeah, Kelvin said. I figured you'd call eventually. He didn't ask what had happened, he just said, when do you need me? The answer was now. The answer had been sent 7 days ago, but now was what Darius had. Kelvin started the following morning. The first report came 4 days later. Simone was living in Lincoln Park. Nice building, doorman. The kind of address that didn't happen on a tier salary or a consulting retainer. The lease was in the name of a man Darius recognized with a slowness that felt physical. Preston Lane, 38 years old, real estate developer. The kind of man who showed up at biotech conferences in tailored suits and asked questions that sounded like curiosity and felt like something else. Darius had met him once, exactly once. At a conference 14 months ago, Preston had been interested in the compound delivery research, had asked several very specific questions, had nodded and said something gracious and moved on. Darius had gone home that evening and told Simone about the conversation over dinner. Remembered that now. He remembered telling her exactly what Preston had asked about. The delivery mechanism. The specific angle of the research. The timeline to publication. He remembered because she'd asked a follow-up question. A good one. A specific one. The kind that meant she'd been listening. He understood now what kind of listening that had been. The second part of Kelvin's report was worse. A startup had been incorporated 4 months earlier, biotech. Small's operation, 2 listed partners, a filing address in the West Loop. The lead partner was Preston Lane. The company had submitted a federal research grant application 6 weeks prior. Kelvin had pulled the application. He'd sent it to Darius as a PDF with a single line underneath. Read pages 4 through 9 and tell me what you see. Darius read pages 4 through 9. He read them once. Then he read them again more slowly. The compound delivery method described on those pages was his, not inspired by his. Not adjacent to his. The approach, the mechanism, the framing of the core problem and how to solve it. It was language he would have written himself. It was in several places language he had written. Passages that existed in his unpublished research documents and nowhere else. Because the research wasn't published yet. Because it still on files marked restricted on a university server. Files that Simone had accessed 7 months ago. He set his phone down on the kitchen counter. The kids were in the other room watching something loud and animated. He could hear Zara narrating over whatever was on screen, adding her own commentary because she always added her own commentary. He picked the phone back up, called his attorney. Said 3 words before anything else. It's worse than the marriage. His attorney's name was Bernard Okafor, 46. Sharp enough to hear what those 5 words meant without needing the rest of the sentence. He asked Darius to come in the next morning. Darius went. He brought the banking records, the IT report, and Kelvin's file. Bernard read everything without saying much. Then he read it again. Then he put it down and looked at Darius, the way doctors look at patients when the news is real, and it isn't good. And there's no version of the next sentence that's comfortable. This is intellectual property theft, Bernard said. We can file. Will it hold? If the grant application contains what you're saying it contains, and if we can establish chain of access from your wife's login to Preston Lane's filing, yes. It holds. Preston will fight it. He will. How long? Bernard leaned back. Could be a year, could be 2. Darius looked at the window. Oak Park in November. Gray sky. Trees already bare. Then we file, he said. He drove home, made dinner. Ezra complained about the broccoli. Theo ate his without being asked, which was unusual enough that Jade made a production of pointing it out. Zara announced she'd learned a new dinosaur name, Pachycephalosaurus. She pronounced it perfectly. Everyone at the table stopped eating for a moment. How do you know that word? Darius asked. Zara shrugged. It was in the book. We've read that book probably 60 times. 63, Zara said. I counted. He looked at his 4 children in the dinner light. That was the night he decided he wasn't going to explain anything to them yet. Not the lawsuit, not the research, not the woman who'd left a note and hadn't called in 3 weeks. He was going to protect the ordinary for as long as ordinary was available. Because they deserved the ordinary. They'd done nothing to lose it. He cleaned up after dinner. Alone. The way he'd been doing everything lately. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a long time before he could make himself get up. The discovery about Dolores came 6 weeks into the legal process. Bernard had been digging through everything. Financial records, phone records, timeline of events. The kind of evidence work that was slow and unglamorous and absolutely necessary. His paralegal had flagged something in the credit card records Bernard subpoenaed as part of the case. A dinner charge. Gold Coast neighborhood. A restaurant that ran about $200 a head. The date was 3 months before Simone left. The card belonged to Aunt Dolores. The reservation, when Bernard tracked it, had been made for 2, and the second person at that table, cross-referenced through the restaurant's private event records. A birthday dinner in the private back room was Preston Lane. Bernard called Darius on a Thursday afternoon to tell him. Darius was in the lab. He set down what he was holding. Very carefully. She introduced them, he said. It appears so, Bernard said. She came to my house the morning after Simone left, sat at my kitchen table, told me my wife was concerned about my ability to raise my children. I know. She was already in this when she knocked on my door. Yes. He stayed on the phone for another minute without saying anything. Then he said, add it to the file. That was all. He picked up what he'd set down, went back to work. Because the research wasn't going to wait for him to process the particular. No, not particular. Just the scale of what had been assembled around him without his knowledge. He thought about the dinner table, the way he'd described his research to Simone over the years, the way she'd asked good questions, specific questions, the kind that made him feel like she was genuinely engaged with what he was building. He wondered how many of those questions had been for her, and how many had been for someone else. He stopped wondering. It didn't change anything that needed changing. 8 months after Simone walked out, Darius went to a school fundraiser he almost skipped. He was tired. He was always tired. The lawsuit was grinding through its early stages, which meant a lot of paperwork and depositions and hours spent in conference rooms instead of the lab. The research was still happening, but later now. After the kids were in bed, after everything else was handled. He put on a jacket and went to the fundraiser because Ezra's teachers had mentioned it twice. And Darius had noticed Ezra noticing that other parents showed up to things. That was reason enough. The gymnasium was done up with paper streamers and folding tables and the particular optimism of school events, where everyone is slightly overdressed and the coffee is slightly terrible and nobody minds either thing. He got a cup of coffee he didn't drink and stood near the wall and calculated how long he needed to stay to count it as having been there. He was 37 minutes into the calculation when someone appeared beside him. The coffee is bad, she said. Yeah, he said. I've been holding this cup for 20 minutes trying to convince myself to drink it. How's that going? She considered. Poorly. Her name was Camille Okafor. She taught 6th science. She had box braids pulled back at the base of her neck, a fitted navy midi dress, and an expression that suggested she had also done the calculation and arrived at the same minimum time requirement. They talked for maybe 15 minutes. She asked him what he did. He gave the short version, which was that he did biomedical research and was in the middle of starting a company. She said that sounded like a lot. He said it was. She didn't press. She didn't ask why he was there, alone. She didn't ask about the kid's mother. She just talked to him like a person talking to another person at a bad coffee school event, which sounds like nothing, and was, that evening, something. She left when her minimum time was up. He left shortly after. The next morning was a morning, then another one, and another. The lawsuit moved. The research moved slow, so the kids grew in increments that snuck up on him. One day Theo's pants were 2 inches short, and Darius had no memory of when that happened. Camille volunteered at the school twice a week. She ran into Darius at pickup once when he was 20 minutes late because the deposition had gone long and nobody had warned him how long they could go. She offered to stay with the kids until he got there. She didn't make a thing of it, she just stayed. He thanked her. She waved it off. That was how it started. Which was to say, it didn't start as anything. It was just someone being decent. He'd forgotten how much weight decent could carry when you were running low on most other things. She brought the kids paper cups of juice from the teacher's lounge one afternoon when they were waiting. Zara recited the 14 dinosaurs. Camille listened to all of them without checking her phone. Pachycephalosaurus, Camille said at the end. That's my favorite. Zara looked at her with absolute seriousness. That's the right answer. Darius watched that exchange and felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically. Not the way things shifted in movies. More like a window cracking open in a room that had been closed for too long. Just a little. Just enough. The lawsuit took 22 months. He mortgaged the house. Once. He sold the field microscope he'd had since graduate school, the expensive one, the one he'd promised himself he'd never sell. He sold it quietly and didn't tell the kids why the shelf in the lab room looked different. Some things you carry alone because putting them down would mean stopping. The research continued in pieces. Nights, mostly. The lab above the hardware store on North Avenue, which he rented because it was cheap and because nobody there asked him questions. He'd bring coffee, set up after midnight when the 4 kids were down, work until his eyes gave out, drive home in the early morning. He wasn't chasing a breakthrough. He was refusing to stop. Preston Lane's legal team was expensive and well-prepared and argued that Simone had shared the research voluntarily as part of an informal salting arrangement, which was a phrase Darius' attorney described in private as creative. The case turned on chain of access, on timestamps, on the specific structure of the grant application versus the specific structure of Darius' unpublished files. It turned, in the end, on precision, which was the one thing Darius understood better than anyone on the other side of the conference table. Month 14, Preston's team made an offer to settle. Darius said no. Month 18, they made another one. Darius said no. Month 22, the ruling came. Full finding in his favor. Patent secured under his name alone. Damages owed by Preston Lane. The grant application voided. He walked out of the courthouse in the November cold and sat in his car in the parking garage. 20 minutes. He just sat there. Winning, it turned out, didn't look the way he'd expected it to look. He'd expected some kind of release. Some version of the weightlifting. Instead, he sat in a parking garage with the engine off and felt something he could only call the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running for so long that stopping is more disorienting than the running was. He drove home, made dinner. Ezra wanted to know if they could have breakfast for dinner. They had breakfast for dinner. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. Standard envelope. His name typed on the front. No note inside. Simone's had filed on grounds of irreconcilable differences and length of separation. She wasn't contesting custody. She wasn't asking for anything from WellPath, which he'd formally incorporated 6 months earlier. She just wanted out cleanly and on paper, on a timeline that had nothing to do with his. He signed, mailed it back, didn't add a word. That night was a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week as the night with the note, though he only realized that later. He made lunches for the next morning. 4 of them. Ezra's without orange chips. 12 chips for Jade, exactly. Whatever Zara wanted. Asked first, he put them in the refrigerator, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed before midnight for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember. The first year without Simone was not a year. It was a series of Tuesdays. That was how Darius experienced time during that stretch. Not in months, not in seasons, though he was vaguely aware of seasons passing. Coats got heavier and then lighter and then heavier again. Just Tuesdays. The day that had split his life into before and after, repeating itself over and over like it was trying to prove a point. Every Tuesday he woke up and made 4 lunches, and got 4 children ready for school and drove them there, and came home to a house that was quieter than any house, with 4 6-year-olds in it had any right to be when the 6-year-olds were absent. Then he sat at the kitchen table for approximately 12 minutes before he could make himself go to the lab. He timed it eventually. 12 minutes. It's consistent. Like his body had decided that was the required toll and it was going to collect it every single time. He stopped trying to skip the 12 minutes. He just built them into the schedule. WellPath Biosciences existed on paper by month 4, incorporated, filed. A name on a document in the state of Illinois. 4 employees, which was a generous use of the word employees, since 2 of them were graduate students who worked part-time for stipends that Darius partially funded out of his own rapidly thinning accounts. The lawsuit was eating money the way fire eats dry grass, fast and without particular preference for what it consumed. His research success recovered the insurance on a car that was 2 years past needing new tires. Bernard's retainer came out of savings, then out of a credit line, then out of savings again when the credit line hit its limit. He didn't talk to anyone about the money situation ex-Bernard who needed to know, and his accountant who definitely needed to know. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell his brother in Atlanta. He especially didn't the kids, who had no framework for understanding that the house they lived in was being used as a financial instrument in a legal battle against their mother's boyfriend. That sentence. He thought it sometimes at 2 in the morning. Their mother's boyfriend. The man who had their mother's access codes and the ardent research and the audacity to file a federal grant application using language lifted directly from documents that didn't belong to him. Preston Lane, who had, as of month 5, lawyered up with a firm in downtown Chicago that charged $450 an hour and been billed in 15-minute increments. Which Darius knew because Bernard had looked them up and delivered the information with the expression of a man preparing someone for unpleasant weather. They're going to argue that Simone shared the research as an informal consulting partner, Bernard said. Voluntarily. They'll say the information was disclosed in the context of a collaborative relationship. There was no collaborative relationship. I know that. She accessed restricted files using a guest login she was never supposed to use for research purposes. I know that too. So we have the timestamps, we have the access logs, we have the grant application language sitting next to my unpublished documents like a copy of a copy. We do, Bernard said. And they have a very expensive lawyer who is going to spend the next 18 months making the jury feel uncertain about what a timestamp actually proves. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then we make it unambiguous, he said. That's the plan, Bernard said. The plan required more documentation than Darius had initially anticipated. It required forensic analysis of the grant application language. Side-by-side comparison of structural methodology. Expert witnesses who could explain to a jury of non-scientists why the compound delivery approach in Preston might not have been independently derived, and why the specific framing of the problem solved a notch in the research that only existed in Darius's version of the work. It was, as Bernard described it, the kind of case that won on detail, which meant it was also the kind of case that cost on detail. Month 7, Darius refinanced the house. He did it on a Wednesday morning while the kids were at school. Signed the paperwork at the bank, drove to the lab. Did not think about it again until he was trying to sleep that night and it thought about him instead. He lay in the dark and did the kind of math that people who are trying not to panic do. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were not comfortable. They existed in a range he would describe, if forced to describe them, as survivable with precision. He was going to have to be very precise. Month 8 brought 2 things. The first was Kelvin's follow-up report on Aunt Dolores. The second was Camille. Kelvin had been digging into the timeline of how Preston Lane had come to know Simone. The affair, if you wanted to call it that, wasn't the origin. The origin was earlier. Kelvin had worked backward through phone records and public photos and found the thread. Dolores had known Preston Lane through a property investment group she'd been involved with for 3 years. The same group Preston had used to fund his early real estate ventures. Dolores wasn't a significant investor, but she was connected enough to have his number, connected enough to have dinner with him. That dinner at the Gold Coast restaurant, three months before Simone left. Bernard had already flagged it, but Kelvin had gone further. He'd found a second meeting, a coffee documented by a receipt that showed up in Dolores's bank records because Kelvin had a source, and the source had access, and none of this was information Darius had ever wanted to need. Second meeting was 2 months before Simone left. The timeline was clear now. Dolores had brokered the introduction, had facilitated the relationship between her niece and a man who had expressed specific interest in Darius's research area. Had sat at Darius's kitchen table the morning after Simone walked out and delivered a speech about stability and the children's best interests. While she already knew, while she had helped plan the room Simone walked into when she left. Darius received this information on a Thursday afternoon. He was sitting in his car in the school pickup line when his phone buzzed with Kelvin's message. He read it. Then he looked up at the school building, where Ezra and Theo and Jade and Zara were somewhere inside finishing their day, probably arguing about whose turn it was to carry the reading log home. He thought about Dolores sitting at his table, her prepared words, her folded hands, the way she had said your ability to manage 4 children with the tone of someone delivering a verdict. He felt something move through him that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief. Something in between, something that had weight and temperature and needed somewhere to go. He put his phone in his cup holder. He texted Bernard, "New information, call me tonight." Then the school doors opened and Zara came out first, as always, already talking to someone before she'd fully cleared the doorway. Jade behind her, backpack organized exactly the way she'd organized it in the morning. Theo and Ezra together, Ezra with his arm around his brother's shoulders, the way he'd sleep was his arm hanging over the bunk bed. They piled into the car. "Dad," Zara said, "did you know that some dinosaurs had feathers?" "I did," he said. "Like birds," she said. "Like birds," he agreed. "So birds are basically dinosaurs." Basically. Zara considered this with the gravity of someone processing a philosophical revelation. Then she nodded. Cool. He drove home, made dinner, did not think about Dolores again until the kids were asleep. The school fundraiser was on a Friday night in November. He almost skipped it. He had legitimate reasons to skip it. He was behind on 2 research documents. The forensic analysis Bernard needed was only half compiled. He had approximately 47 things that were more urgent than a gymnasium full of folding tables and bad coffee, except Ezra's teacher had mentioned it. And Ezra had been quieter than usual that week. Watching Darius sometimes, with an expression that was too careful for a 6-year-old. The kind of watching that meant the kid was paying attention to things he shouldn't have to pay attention to at 6. So Darius put on a jacket. He stood near the wall with a cup of coffee he already knew was terrible and did the math on minimum time. Camille Okafor appeared beside him and said the coffee was bad. He said yeah. And they talked for 15 minutes about nothing consequential. What he did, Sheets did. The general quality of school gymnasium coffee as a category. She's box braids tonight, pulled back loosely. A fitted navy midi dress. The expression of someone who had also done the minimum time calculation and was being honest about it. She didn't ask about some Simone. She didn't ask why he was there alone. She left when her time was up. He watched her go and then looked back at the bad coffee in his hand and thought, that was the full extent of the thought. She volunteered at the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He saw her at pickup maybe once every 2 weeks. They talked the way people talk at school pickups, short sentences, updates about nothing. The weather once, memorably, for about 90 seconds. She was decent to him. That was the thing he kept noticing. She was just decent, straightforward and warm without performing either quality. She asked him once how the company was going, and when he gave a vague answer, she didn't push. She listened when he did talk. She didn't fill assents with noise, just because the silence was there. Month 10, there was a deposition that ran 4 hours past its scheduled end time. Darius texted Camille at 4:15. "I'm stuck downtown. Deposition. Could you wait with the kids until I can get there? I can be there by 6. He sent it before he fully registered what he was doing. Then he stared at his phone for 30 seconds. He had sent that text to his neighbor before. His neighbor was currently in Florida for a medical thing and wouldn't be back for a month. He had approximately 2 people he could call in this situation, and one of them was unavailable, and the other was Camille, who was already at the school. Not the worst logic in the world. Her reply came in under a minute. Already here. Take your time. He didn't take his time. He wrapped the depositions as fast as humanly possible. He got to the school at 5:53. Camille was sitting on the bench outside the main entrance with all 4 kids. Zara was in the middle of what appeared to be a comprehensive explanation of feathered dinosaurs. Jed had her backpack open and organized in her lap. Theo and Ezra were doing something involving a stick and a crack in the pavement that seemed to have rules neither of them had explained to anyone else. "I'm so sorry," Darius said. "We're fine," Camille said. "Zara taught us about Archaeopteryx. It was a dinosaur that was also a bird," Zara clarified. "We got the whole lesson," Camille said. He looked at her. She looked back, easy, unbothered. He thanked her. She waved it off and said goodbye to the kids, who said goodbye back with the casualness of children who have decided someone is already part of the furniture of their life. He drove home thinking about that. How quickly kids decided, how little ceremony they needed. He didn't analyze it beyond that. But he also didn't analyze how she had said take your time like she meant it. Like she'd already checked her calendar and found nothing more important than sitting on a bench while a 6-year-old explained prehistoric birds. He didn't analyze any of that. Much. Month 12 brought the second Kelvin report. So one that changed the shape of the case in ways Darius hadn't anticipated. Kelvin had been sitting on one more thread. Something he'd flagged in the preliminary findings and then waited to confirm before passing it along. Because Kelvin was the kind of investigator who did not deliver half-confirmed information and would rather be late and right than prompt and wrong. He called Darius on a Sunday morning. Kids were at the kitchen table with cereal, cartoons on the TV in the next room. Normal Sunday texture, which was the only kind of morning Darius consistently tried to protect. "You're going to want to step outside," Kelvin said. Darius stepped outside. "Preston's company," Kelvin said, "the startup. I ran their prior filings, not the federal grant, their earlier work. The first 18 months of their corporate history. Okay? They applied for a different grant 2 years ago. Different research direction. Developmental drug encapsulation. Small application. Didn't go anywhere. Okay. The methodology section of that application has language that matches a published paper. Not Darius's work. A paper by a researcher in Houston. The paper came out 8 months before Preston's application." Darius was quiet. "So this isn't the first time," he said. "No," Kelvin said. "It doesn't appear to be. He's done this before." "There's a pattern," Kelvin said. "At minimum a pattern. I'd need more time to confirm additional instances, but based on what I have, yeah. This is not a man who stumbled into an idea. This is a man who has a method." Darius stood on his front porch in the November cold and looked at the street. Same street as always, same houses, same bare trees. "Send everything to Bernard," he said. "Already did," Kelvin said. He went back inside, poured himself more coffee, sat at the table with his 4 kids and watched Theo correct Ezra's cereal pouring technique with the patience of a boy who had apparently decided he was the household expert on cereal. He did not think about Preston Lane again until that evening. But when he did, it was different. It was the thought of a man who had stopped being surprised and started being precise. There was a difference. Month 15, Camille showed up at his front door on a Tuesday evening. He had not called her. She had been driving past, she said, which was plausible because she lived 3 streets over. She had made a chicken dish that was too much for one person and she thought the kids might like it. She was holding a covered pot that smelled like and something else warm. He opened the door wider. She came in. Jade was immediately interested in the pot. Zara wanted to know if it had any vegetables she hadn't tried yet. Theo said he didn't like new foods, which was factually inaccurate since he had eaten 3 new foods in the past month. And Ezra told him so with fraternal directness. They ate. Camille sat at the end of the table and talked to the kids and didn't try to sit in any particular spot and didn't make any particular thing of the evening. When dinner was done, she helped clear the table without being asked and then said she should get going and got going. Darius stood at the kitchen sink after she left and thought, she brought a whole pot. Which was a strange thought. But it was the thought he had. She had brought a whole pot, covered, still warm, which meant she had cooked it and then gotten in her car with it and driven it here. That was not the act of someone passing by. That was the act of someone who had decided to do a thing and then done the thing. He washed the pot, dried it, set it on the counter to return. He was still thinking about the pot at 2 in the morning in the lab, which was unusual, because at 2 in the morning in the lab, he generally thought about nothing except the research. The pot got returned. She used it again the following week. He didn't ask why she'd come, she didn't explain. The kids started on Tuesdays as if Ms. Okafor was coming, because the regularity had established itself without anyone formally establishing it. She came maybe once a week, sometimes twice, not always with food. Sometimes she sat at the kitchen table and graded papers while he did lab work at the desk in the corner. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, which is the rarest kind and the easiest kind to take for granted if you're not paying attention. He was paying attention. Month 18 was the worst month. Preston's lawyers filed a motion that effectively argued Simone had standing as an informal research collaborator, and that information shared in a marital context constituted a form of mutual disclosure. It was, as Bernard said privately, a creative argument. It was also, as Bernard said publicly in the filing, entirely without legal merit. But it delayed things, it required additional documentation. It meant more hours, more money, more of Darius's research time redirected into evidence compilation. He sold the field microscope on a Wednesday. He'd had it since graduate school. It was the good one. The one he'd told himself more than once that he'd never sell. He sold it to a research lab at Northwestern for $6,000, which was less than it was worth and also exactly what he needed to cover the gap in February's bills. He didn't tell anyone. Not Camille, not his attorney, not his brother in Atlanta who called once a week and asked how things were going and received the answer fine, just busy, which was technically true and practically incomplete. He put the money where it needed to go, filed his taxes that week, looked at the number at the bottom of the return for a long time. Survivable with precision. Still true. Still barely true. He kept working. The kids were 7 now, then turning 8. Ezra had started reading chapter books and narrating them to Theo at bedtime whether Theo wanted to hear them or not. Jade had developed what she called a recording habit, which was that she carried a small voice recorder everywhere and documented things she thought were important. She had accumulated 43 recordings. She would not explain her filing system to anyone. Darius didn't press. He recognized the impulse in her, the need to hold on to things, to archive the significant moments before they became something you could only half remember. He'd done the same thing in graduate school, keeping lab notebooks so detailed his advisors had once joked that he could reconstruct the work from the journals alone if every other document burned. Let her record things, whatever she needed. Month 21, Bernard called at 6:30 in the morning. Darius was already up. He was always already up. They want to settle, Bernard said. What are they offering? Bernard told him. The number was not nothing. It was, objectively, a reasonable settlement offer for a case with the complexity this one had developed. It would cover the legal fees, clear the mortgage situation, and leave him with something that could be described as breathing room. No, Darius said. Darius knows. Bernard was quiet for a moment. If we go to trial and lose, Bernard said carefully, the costs will. We're not going to lose, Darius said. The methodology section is lifted language. The access logs are time-stamped. We have evidence of pattern from a prior application. If we settle, Preston Lane walks away owing money but not owning anything he did. If we go to trial and win, the patent is mine. The precedent is established. He can't do this to anyone else with work that touches mine. Bernard let that sit. No, Darius said again. We go to trial. Month 22 was the trial. It ran 6 days. Darius sat at the plaintiff's table in a suit he'd bought 3 years ago and had dry cleaned twice in the intervening period, and looked at Preston Lane across the room every morning and felt nothing that interfered with his ability to think clearly. That was the thing. He felt nothing theatrical. No heat, no trembling, no cinematic revenge fantasy playing behind his eyes. What he felt was the sustained quiet attention of a scientist who had prepared his data correctly and was waiting for the opportunity to present it. The expert witness on day 3 compared 57 passages between the grant application and Darius's restricted research files. 57. The prior application pattern, as documented by Kelvin and established through Bernard's research filings, was admitted into evidence on day 4. Preston's lawyers argued creative coincidence and independent derivation with decreasing conviction as the week went on. The jury was out for 11 hours. The verdict was clear, full finding in Darius's favor. Patent secured. Damages awarded. The grant application voided at the federal level, which meant Preston's company lost the funding that had been conditionally attached to it. Bernard shook his hand in the hallway. Darius nodded, walked to his car, sat in the parking garage. 23 minutes this time. He'd been in the parking garage after the wind 20 minutes, so apparently each level of victory required additional time to process. He sat there in November cold with the engine off, and felt something he could only describe as the specific exhaustion of a man who had been clenching muscle in his body for 22 months, and had just been told he could stop. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollowed out, in a way that wasn't bad exactly. More like a room that had been emptied of furniture that had been too heavy to move for too long. The room was still there. He was still there. But the weight was gone, and the absence of it was its own kind of disorientation. He drove home. Camille was in the kitchen. She was there when the kids had things after school, still there, sometimes by the time he got home. She had her own key by month 16. He had given it to her without making a production of it. She had taken it the same way. She looked at him when he came through the door. He looked back. "We won," he said. She nodded once, slow. Then she turned back to the pot on the stove and said, "Good. Sit down, dinner's almost done." He sat. Ezra came through from the other room and said, "Dad, you look weird." "I'm fine," Darius said. "You look like you ran a really long race," Ezra said. "Something like that." Ezra accepted this and went back to whatever he'd been doing, which was typical Ezra logic. Ask the question, get an answer, move on. Jade emerged with her voice recorder. She pressed play without explanation. A recording from a few months earlier. Darius in the kitchen, late, talking to himself while he did the dishes. Something about the research. Something half-formed and quiet. "I kept that one," she said. "Why?" he asked. She shrugged. It sounded important. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, serious-faced, recorder in hand like it was standard equipment. "Yeah," he said. "I think it was." The divorce papers had come 3 weeks after the trial, clean and unceremonious. Simone's filing stated irreconcilable differences and length of separation. No contest on custody. No claim on Wellpath, which had been formally incorporated as a separate legal entity and was therefore not marital property subject to division. Just a signature line and a return envelope. He signed on a Sunday evening while the kids were watching something in the other room, sealed the envelope, put it by the door to mail in the morning. Then he went to the kitchen and started making lunches for the next day. 4 of them. No orange chips for Ezra. 12 chips for Jade. He counted them this time, which he didn't always do, though Jade had never actually called him out on the count being wrong. He wondered, sometimes, if she checked. He suspected she did. He put the lunches in the refrigerator, turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark for a moment. 8 years old, all 4 of them. 8 years old and already making sense of a world that had rearranged itself without asking their permission, the way worlds do. Ezra with his arm over the side of the bunk bed. Theo with his blanket kicked to the foot. Jade with her recorder and her filing system he was never going to fully understand. Zara with her 14 dinosaurs and the calm absolute certainty that the right answer was always worth stating. He had not given them a perfect life. He had given them him. Every single day. Imperfect and tired and sometimes running on the last reserves of whatever resolve looks like at 3 in the morning. He had given them that. He turned and walked down the hall to his room. And for the first time in 2 years he was asleep before midnight. The years after the verdict were quieter. Not easy, not smooth. Not the version of after that people imagine when they're in the middle of a hard thing. Just quieter. The way a storm quiet after the worst of it has passed and the air has that particular charged quality, clean and heavy at the same time, that makes you aware of the silence because the silence is new. Wellpath grew. Slowly at first, then less slowly. The compound delivery research, the thing Darius had been chasing since graduate school, the thing that had been stolen, fought over, and nearly lost and won back through 22 months of grinding documented precision, turned out to work. Not just in theory. On the bench, repeatable, 3 times in a row and then 30 times and then enough times that the results were publishable, and the publication brought interest from a funding group in Chicago that put real money behind the work. 4 employees became 9. 9 became 22. Darius hired a lab director so he could sleep past 5 in the morning on days he didn't have early meetings. He slept past 5 exactly twice in the first year. Progress. Camille was there through all of it. She had not moved in. She had not announced anything. She had simply come with the first nuance, consistently and without drama. The way some people become part of the architecture of a life so gradually that you stop noticing where they start and where everything else ends. She came to Jade's school science fair and spent 45 minutes asking detailed questions about Jade's school because she was a science teacher and she had opinions. And Jade had opinions, and the conversation between them was so animated that the other parents standing nearby started listening in. She taught Theo to cook one thing well: scrambled eggs. Perfect scrambled eggs, the kind you have to pay attention to. He made them every Saturday morning for 6 months until he decided he'd mastered them and then stopped. Which Camille said was exactly correct. You learn a thing until you know it and then you move on. She sat next to Zara once during a dinosaur phase and listened to the full 14. Then she came back with a list of 4 more. Zara looked at the list like Camille had handed her a gift. 18 new dinosaurs after that. Darius watched these things happen from whatever angle he was standing at. Doing dishes or sitting at the kitchen table, with a laptop or coming through the door from work, and felt something settle in his chest one layer at a time. Not dramatic, not announced, just the gradual specific settling of a person who has been braced for a long time and is, finally, learning what it feels like to stop. She held his hand once during a particularly terrible school talent show, where the sound system failed twice, and 3 kids cried and Theo played a keyboard piece that was technically a different piece than the one he'd been practicing, which he only revealed after it was over. She held his hand through the whole thing without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing it. He didn't let go. She noticed that he didn't let go. He noticed that she noticed. Neither of them said anything about it, which was, he had come to understand exactly, quietly, without ceremony, the way things has become true before anyone has put words to them. Ezra turned 14 and asked Darius one last question that came out of nowhere on a Wednesday evening. Did you know, Ezra said, that you were doing the right thing back then? Darius looked at his son. Ezra was at the kitchen table, not quite meeting his eyes. The question had come in the middle of doing nothing in particular, which was when Ezra's most serious questions always arrived. I didn't know, Darius said honestly. I just didn't know how to stop. Ezra nodded, looked at the table. Okay, he said. That was all. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. Darius stood at the counter and understood, without being told, that the question had a source. That somewhere in the architecture of Ezra's 14-year-old mind, something had shifted. That the boy who had always stood guard, even at 6 years old with one arm hanging over the side of a bunk bed, had seen or heard or found something that had made him need to ask. He did not push. He trusted that Ezra would bring it to him when he was ready. 3 weeks later, Ezra was ready. He knocked on Darius's office door on a Saturday afternoon. Held an old laptop under his arm. The family laptop. The one nobody had used since before Simone left, because the battery had died and it had been sitting in the back of the closet for years, and nobody had gotten around to replacing the charger. Except apparently someone had. Ezra set the laptop on the desk, opened it, angled the screen toward Darius, an email chain, old. 8 years old. The timestamps placed it 2 years before Simone left. The subject line was blank. The first email in the chain was from Simone's address to an address Darius didn't recognize immediately, and then did, because it was one he'd seen in Discovery Materials years ago, in Preston Lane. The message was 2 lines. He doesn't notice anything. He never does. When do you want me to pull the files? Darius read it once, then he read it again. Ezra stood on the other side of the desk and watched his father's face. I found it last month, Ezra said. I didn't know what to do with it. Did you show it to anyone? No. Not your brother? Your sisters? No, Ezra said. I thought it should be yours first. Darius looked his son, 14 years old, standing very straight. His jaw set in a way that reminded Darius, suddenly and completely, of looking in a mirror. Close the laptop, he said. Ezra closed it. Does it change anything? Ezra asked. Darius was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Everything that needed to happen already happened. Does it change how you feel? Another moment. It changes how much I know, Darius said. That's different. Ezra nodded once, slow. The way someone nods when they've been carrying a question for weeks, and the answer isn't the one they wanted, but it's real, and real is what they came for. He picked up the laptop, then stopped it at the door. Dad, he said without turning around. Yeah? You were doing the right thing? He left. Darius sat at his desk for a while after that. Not 23 minutes this time. Not a timed interval of any kind. Just however long it took the weight of 8 years of not knowing to rearrange itself in his chest into something he could live with. Which turned out to be about as long as it took for Zara to yell from the kitchen that dinner wasn't going to cook itself. Which was Zara's way of she'd saying started something and needed supervision. He got up, washed his hands, went to the kitchen, and made dinner. 12 years is long enough to forget what the beginning felt like, not the facts of it. The facts stayed. The note on the table, the ring beside the napkin holder, the refrigerator hum. Those things didn't go anywhere. They just stopped having the same weight they'd had at 30. The way a scar stops hurting but stays visible. You know it's there. You stop touching it every morning to check. What Darius Wells had built in 12 years was not a monument to what happened. It was something quieter than that. 31 people working in a research campus in Hyde Park. A compound delivery method that had gone from a restricted file on a university server to a licensed technology in 3 clinical trials. A company with his name on the door that had survived a lawsuit, 2 refinanced mortgages, and the sale of a field microscope he'd promised himself he would never sell. It had survived because he had refused to stop. Not because stopping would have been wrong. Because stopping was simply not a thing his body knew how to do when 4 people needed him to keep going. The Chicago Innovation Awards happened every November at the Blackstone Hotel on South Michigan Avenue. The kind of room that had been hosting significant evenings for longer than anyone currently alive could personally remember. High ceilings, chandeliers that threw light in every direction without apology. The sort of ballroom that didn't need to announce its own history because the history was structural. You felt it when you walked in. Darius arrived with 5 people. Ezra, 18 years old. 3 afternoons a week at Wells, already deep in conversations about graduate programs in biomedical engineering, with the focused certainty of someone who had known their direction for years, had simply been waiting to be old enough to move in it. He wore a dark suit he'd bought himself, stood the way he always stood, like the job of keeping watch over everyone he loved was a permanent appointment he'd made at age 6 and had never once reconsidered. Theo. 18. First year of community college, working part-time at a restaurant downtown where he had, by his own account, significantly improved the quality of the staff meal through the introduction of properly made scrambled eggs. Nobody had independently verified this. Nobody had challenged it either, because Theo said it with the particular calm of someone reporting a fact rather than making a claim. And that calm tended to discourage argument. Jade, 18, still carried a recorder. The technology had evolved considerably since the plastic toy from childhood, but the impulse was identical. She noticed things other people passed without stopping. She kept them. She had a filing system that she had never fully explained to anyone in the family, and that nobody had ever successfully reverse-engineered. Zara, 18, said what she meant. Always. Without preface and without the softening that most people applied automatically to difficult truths. Had 22 tiny toe styles now, added methodically over the years, and wore a fitted emerald dress with knotless braids she'd had done that morning and had looked extraordinary in since approximately 10 a.m. And Camille, who sat to Darius's left at the table near the front of the room. Not because the seating chart had placed her there, because that was where she sat. Had been where she sat, at tables and in kitchens and in school auditoriums and at a booth in a corner pizza restaurant for 6 years now. No announcement had been made about this arrangement. No ceremony had formalized it. It had simply become true the way some things become true. Through repetition, through consistency, through the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that eventually add up to something neither small nor reversible. She wore a burgundy wraps, dress silk press falling straight to her collarbone, and she looked like herself. Which was to say she looked like the woman who had shown up at a school fundraiser 8 years ago and talked to him for 15 minutes about bad coffee and then left when her minimum time was up. Who had appeared at his front door on a Tuesday evening with a covered pot that smelled like garlic and something warm. Who had sat at his kitchen table grading papers in silence on nights when he had nothing left to say and hadn't asked him to be different than he was. She looked like the person who had chosen, without fanfare and without guarantee, to be here. The room filled around them. 300 people in formal were doing what doing formal wear for do at these events. It's being seen, trying to appear as though being seen is incidental, filling the air with the particular noise of a crowd that has dressed for importance. Darius looked at his 4 children. He thought about a different table. Oak Park, 4 high chairs, spaghetti everywhere including the floor. 4 6-year-olds who had no idea that the ground was about to shift under all of them. He thought, look what they became. He thought it quietly. To himself, the way he did everything that mattered. The ceremony moved through its categories: speeches, applause, the organized gratitude of people who had worked hard and wanted a room to know it, which was reasonable, which was human. Darius ate dinner and answered Theo's questions about the award criteria and listened to Zara provide running commentary to Jade about the centerpiece flowers. Quiet enough that only the table could hear. Pointed enough that Jade recorded approximately 40 seconds of it. Then the biomedical innovation category. 3 nominees. The presenter read each one. Third, Darius Wells and WellPath Biosciences for a compound delivery mechanism with demonstrated clinical efficacy, developed over 12 years of independent research. 12 years. Said out loud in a room of 300 people, it sounded finished. The way things sound when time has processed them into something clean and complete. Didn't feel finished from the inside. From the inside, it still had the texture of Tuesday mornings and parking garage and a shelf in Hyde Park where something used to sit. They called his name. The applause started at the front and moved back through the room. Built as it went, became the whole room standing. Darius didn't move for 1 full second, just one. The second it took to understand that the sound was real and continuous and one directed at him and was not going to stop on its own. Then Ezra stood. Right next to him, no hesitation, no waiting to see what anyone else did. Then Theo, then Jade, who had already pressed record before she fully rose, which was so completely Jade that something loosened in Darius's chest that had been held tight for longer than he could accurately name. Then Zara, straight back, chin up, the posture of someone who has decided this moment deserves to be met correctly. All 4, standing, unrequest. And Sen Camille, who rose last and put her hand on Darius's arm for exactly 1 second before he moved. Not to hold him back, not to make a moment of it, just to say, I am here, I have been here. This is real and I am part of it. He felt that hand for the rest of the night. They walked to the stage together. 5 of them. Darius and 4 18-year-olds who had once needed help reaching the bathroom sink and had grown, without asking his permission, into people who stood on stages in formal wear and looked like they belonged there. He stood at the podium. 300 faces looking up. None of them knew about the parking garage, the microscope, the 12 minutes every morning, the Tuesday that started all of it. He said thank you, meant it in a way that had no adequate public expression, said it anyway, and walked off stage with 4 people who had been present for every single thing the room would never know. His PR coordinator found him backstage. Her name was Lena, 29. The kind of professional who delivered difficult information without softening it necessarily, because she understood that the people who hired her for precision didn't benefit from cushioning. She found him near the curtain with the careful expression she wore when the information was real. There's a woman in the ballroom, she said. Okay, she's been asking questions. Who sits on the board? Who holds the voting shares? A pause. She asked specifically about WellPath's ownership structure. Darius looked at her. She gave a name, Lena said. Simone. The ballroom noise continued past the curtain. Orchestra. Conversation. The ambient sound of a room full of people who had no idea that the word Simone had just arrived backstage like something thrown without warning. He was quiet for a moment. Not because he needed to process the name. He knew the name, had known it for 18 years. HimTo had signed it on a marriage certificate and heard it in a hospital when the nurse said, "Here's the mother," and seen it on a divorce filing there that arrived in an ordinary envelope on a Wednesday afternoon. He was quiet because of what the question was. After 12 years. After 12 birthdays she hadn't called for. 12 first days of school. 12 Christmases. 12 years of 4 people growing from 6 to 18 without a single phone call she'd made reach in any form he'd ever been told about. The first question she asked about him. Not how are they? Not did they turn out okay? Not even his name. Whose shares are voting shares? He recognized the pattern. The way you recognize something you encountered once a long time ago and haven't thought about since. The melody comes back complete, intact, from wherever it had been filed. Some things don't change. They just wait for the right room to walk back into. "Where is she now?" he asked. "Near the bar," Lena said, "with 2 other women, heading this way." He stepped back from the curtain, looked toward the table where Ezra was already standing, already watching, already knowing, the way Ezra always seemed to know things before he's told, because Ezra had been standing guard since he was old enough to stand. Beside him, Theo had gone quiet. The specific quiet that preceded the things Theo said that mattered. Jade had her recorder out. Zara was watching the room with the steadiest tension of someone who was already detached beside she will not be surprised tonight. Camille stood just behind them, not in front, not announcing herself, just present. The way she had always been present. Darius walked back into the ballroom. They found each other near the edge of the dance floor, where the orchestra's sound softened just enough for voices to carry without effort. Not planned. Just the geometry of a room where 2 trajectories after 12 years finally occupied the same coordinates. Simone, 40 years old, still beautiful. The years had treated her honestly rather than harshly, the kind of aging that shows in the eyes rather than erasing anything. She wore a fitted black dress, silk pressed straight past her collarbone, and she held a champagne flute with both hands wrapped around the stem. Both hands, because one wasn't steady enough. She looked at Darius first, then past him, and when her eyes found the 4 faces behind him, something happened in her expression that had been built for long. It numbed and it rubbed all at once. The way pressure releases when the container finally can't hold it anymore. "Darius," she said. The correction of his name was small, but it cost onto something. "I just 66. I wanted to see my children." Nobody moved. Darius didn't answer, because the answer wasn't his to give first. Ezra spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The voice he used was the one he'd been developing since he was 6 years old, standing at the side of a bunk bed with one arm hanging over the edge. The voice of someone who has been thinking about this moment for a long time and has decided exactly how much force it requires. "You gave us life," he said. "My dad gave us a life. Those aren't the same thing. We understood that a long time ago." Simone's eyes filled. Fast. The was filled when something accurate lands on something that had been unexamined for years. "I know I made mistakes," she said. I didn't know how to." "You knew how to leave a note," Theo said. "Not cruel, not performed. A fact. Delivered with the quietness of someone who has carried it in his chest for 12 years and has just found the correct place to set it down." Simone's mouth opened, closed. The champagne flute shifted in both her hands. She looked at Jade. Jade looked back. Jade had always been the watcher. Even at 6, the one carried a quarter through the house because something in her registered important before her mind could articulate why. The one who had documented 43 recordings in childhood, then hundreds more. Who had a filing system nobody else understood. Who had transferred one specific audio file from device to device through 4 phone upgrades and 1 cracked screen that had nearly lost everything. She had never been able to explain why she couldn't delete it. She just couldn't. She reached into her clutch and took out her phone. Her hands were steadier than Simone's had been all night. "I want you to hear something," she said. "Level, no performance in it. I recorded this when I was 6 years old. Through the crack of my bedroom door, I didn't understand what it meant then. I just knew it felt important enough to keep." She pressed play. The audio was old. The quality of a child's plastic recording device from 12 years ago, tinny and slightly compressed. But the words came through, clear enough that the two tables nearest them went quiet without being asked, the sound pulling attention the way certain sounds do, the ones that carry weight even when you don't know the context. Simone's voice,
12 years younger.
flat and decided. The voice of someone discussing logistics rather than people. They're young, they'll forget. You just worry about the money first. The orchestra kept playing somewhere behind them. Nobody in their small circle moved. Simone went the color of the tablecloths behind her. Where did you? She started, stopped, because there was nowhere for that sentence to go. The voice on the recording was hers. The only argument available would require her to deny what every person in the circle could hear with their own ears. And Simone, whatever she was, had never been a person who wasted energy on arguments with no exit. I was 6, Jade said, not angry. Something on the other side of anger where the heat has burned off and what's left is just the truth, cool and permanent. I didn't know what the money part meant. I didn't understand who you were talking to. I just knew the way you said it. Like we weren't the part you were worried about. Like whatever came first, it wasn't us. Simone's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Who were you talking to? Zara asked. Direct, because Zara asked everything directly we need. No, it wasn't a friend, Zara continued. We know what Preston Lane was to you. We know about the files and the filing and the access logs. We know about Gold Coast. She paused one beat. About Aunt Dolores. At that name, 2 more people arrived from the direction of the bar. Dolores, 68 now, dressed for an event she had not been invited to as anyone's primary guest. Moving through the crowd with the settled authority of a woman who had spent decades walking in rooms as though she belonged in them. Rochelle trailing behind her two steps back, the position she had occupied in relation to this family for as long as anyone could remember. Dolores extended her hand toward Zara. We just want to make peace, she said. Family shouldn't carry something this long. Zara stepped back, clean, no drama. Just a step that said, that hand is not landing here. You had dinner with Preston Lane in Gold Coast, Zara said, loud enough that the nearest tables heard it. 3 months before Simone left. We have the restaurant receipt and the reservation record. And a second meeting the month after, documented the same way. That's not a family grudge. That's a paper trail, and you knew what you were doing when you sat at my father's kitchen table the morning after my mother left, told him he wasn't capable of raising his own children. Dolores' mouth opened, stayed open, the blankness of someone who walked into a room expecting a door and found a wall instead. Rochelle said nothing. Rochelle looked at the floor. The exact posture she had held 12 years ago at a kitchen table in Oak Park, looking at her phone, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Some habits were apparently structural. They didn't change. They just waited for the next room. And then Simone's composure broke. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew the whole ballroom. Just a quiet breaking. The way things break when they've been held together past the point where holding was possible. The champagne flute, both hands let go at once. It hit the marble floor and separated into 3 pieces with a small sound, nothing synesthetic, just glass that had been gripped too tightly for too long. I didn't know it would go this far, she said. To no one. To the floor, maybe. To the version of herself from 12 years ago who had stood kitchen in Oak Park and written 4 sentences on a piece of paper, and left a ring beside the napkin holder and walked out. I didn't think it would still matter this much, this many years later. Darius spoke for the first time since she'd approached. He hadn't planned what he was going to say. He hadn't spent years composing this. He had spent years doing other things, making lunches, running depositions, working past midnight above a hardware store, sitting in parking garages until he could drive. And this moment had not been on the schedule. He just said what was true. It was never about me, he said, not raised, not performed. The voice of a man who has learned through a long and specific education how to say hard things without dressing them up. It was about them, every single day, every birthday, every first day of school, every Tuesday morning for 12 years. It mattered to them whether you were thinking about it or not, whether you remembered or not, whether you picked up the phone or not. The math didn't change just based on what you were doing with your day. Simone's eyes closed, stayed closed. When she opened them, What was there was not composure. Not the certainty of a 28-year-old in a fitted burgundy dress who had made her calculations and acted on them. Just grief. Plain and unmanaged. The kind that arrives when you have been not looking at something for a very long time and you finally look. Security came, quietly. Two men moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of people whose job was to handle exactly this kind of moment, without making it larger than it needed to be. Someone on staff had noticed the broken glass and the small gathered crowd and done the obvious thing. Nobody had requested them. They simply appeared and offered gently and without insistence an escort to the side exit. Simone went without being guided. She was the kind of woman who always recognized when a room had stopped being hers. Dolores went with less grace. But she went. Rochelle went the way she did everything in relation to this situation. 2 steps behind, eyes down. The side door closed, the orchestra played on. 300 people continued their 300 conversations. The gala didn't pause. The gala had no idea it needed to. Darius stood for a moment in the space where they had been. Then Camille was beside him. Not in front. Not making a thing of it. Just beside him the way she'd been beside him for 6 years. Present without requiring acknowledgement of her presence. He reached out, took her hand, not tentative, not checking. A decision made fully, his hand around hers in front of his 4 children and the nearest tables and whoever else happened to be looking in this direction. Camille looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, said nothing, which was the right thing, which was, he had come to understand over 6 years, consistently the right thing with her. She knew when words added something and when they didn't, and she never used them when they didn't. They left through the east exit, 6 of them. Out into the Chicago November, the air cold and clean. The city sharper than it actually was in this kind of cold, every light precise against the dark. Nobody said much on the way to the cars. There wasn't much left that needed saying. 1 week later, they went to the pizza place. Not because anyone organized it. Because Zara said she wanted pizza and that was generally sufficient cause for the family to move in a direction. Theo said he'd been thinking about it. Jade said that was an interesting thing to have been thinking about for a week. Ezra said they were going, which was not a question. Camille said she could go. Darius said fine. 15 minutes later, the booth in the corner. The same one they'd been coming to since the kids needed boosters to reach the table. Same corner. Same vinyl upholstery with the small repair on Ezra's side that had been there since the kids were 10 and had become, through sheer persistence, simply part of the booth. They settled in. The menus came out, which was ritual rather than necessity, since none of them had ordered anything different in years. But the men came out because the menus always came out. The negotiations began. They had evolved from the productions of childhood, 4/6 who needed the pictures to point at, into something faster and no less contested. Crust thickness, topping distribution. The pineapple question, which had never been resolved, showed no signs of resolution, had recently become more complicated because Zara had shifted her position. You used to be on my side, Theo said. I evolved, Zara said. That's not evolution. That's betrayal. Theo, those are different things. Are they, though? Ezra looked at Jade. Jade had her recorder out. She lowered it, reconsidered, put it away. Some moments she had decided were for being in rather than documenting. Darius noticed this. He noticed most things Jade did, because most things Jade did were intentional. The order went in. The restaurant noise settled around them. That particular warm sound of a room full of people eating, conversations overlapping, someone laughing too loud at the bar, a kid at the next table explaining something urgent to an adult who was trying to keep up. Darius looked at his 4 children, and he did something he hadn't done in the same way for a long time. He let himself sit with the full weight of what he was looking at. Not the version of it he carried in motion, making lunches and signing documents and running a company and doing the 12 minutes every morning he would get up and go. The version you only get when you stop moving long enough for everything to catch up with you. He thought about a Tuesday night in Oak Park. A note on a table. 4 sentences. A ring beside the napkin holder. He thought about sitting at that table until sunrise because 4 children were soon in the next room and morning was coming and they were going to need him to look steady. He had looked steady every morning for 12 years. Not because he felt it every morning. He had not felt it every morning. He had felt it approximately 60% of mornings, and the other 40% he had performed it with sufficient accuracy that no one under the age of 14 had been able to tell the difference. That was close enough. That was he had decided early and maintained throughout, the only metric that mattered. 4 people had needed him to keep going, so he had kept going. And here they were, 18 years old, sitting in a corner booth arguing about pineapple. Ezra with his straight-backed posture, Theo with his quiet before the things that mattered, Jade with her recorder she'd decided not to use, Zara saying exactly what she meant and having no plans to stop. Here they were. Camille reached across the table and moved the pepper shaker to Zara's side without being asked, because she had noticed, without being told, that Zara wanted it and was deciding whether to reach. That was the thing about Camille, she noticed. She acted on what she noticed, she didn't announce either. 6 years of that. 6 years of appearing without requiring explanation for her appearance, of staying without staying into something that needed to be discussed, of choosing this family on Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings and school science fairs and depositions that ran 4 hours over schedule. 6 years of choosing, which was more than blood required, which was more than anyone had asked her for. The food arrived. The pineapple debate paused for the practical business of eating, which was the only thing that ever reliably suspended it. Plates moved around the table the way they always did. Ezra cut his slices with more precision than the situation required. Theo ate with the focused attention of someone who had opinions about the process. Jade took exactly the same amount every time, which was also something Darius had noticed. And then Jade, without looking up, without any preparation or announcement, said it. Mom. She said it the way you say a word you've been meaning to say for a while. Not dramatic, not staged, just the word, placed in the air above the table between one moment and the next. Extra cheese on yours? The table went quiet, not all at once. The way quiet arrives when something has landed that requires recalibration. Conversations finishing themselves out. The ambient noise continuing but the immediate space arresting them still. Camille went still. She looked at Jade. Jade was looking at her pizza. Had asked the question the way you ask someone who drives you home when you need it, who shows up at science fairs with actual questions, who sat through 14 dinosaur recitations the first time she met you and never once checked her phone. The way you ask someone who is already the true answer to a question you've been carrying without naming it. Camille looked at Zara. Zara was watching her, calm. The calm of someone who has already decided and is simply waiting for the moment to catch up to the decision. Zaz again. The steadier, the second time. The first time was the door opening and the second time was walking through. Me too? Camille's breath moved. Just once. The small breath of someone absorbing something real. She looked at Darius. He looked back. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. Small. The acknowledgement of something that had been true before it had a name and was simply, finally, being named. Extra cheese, Camille said. Her voice was level. Her eyes were not entirely dry. She didn't try to fix that. For everyone, Theo said, finally under his breath, which made Ezra exhale a laugh that was closer to relief than humor. Zara reached across and stole a piece from Theo's plate with the serenity of someone who knew she wouldn't be stopped. Jade picked up her recorder, held it in her hand for a moment, put it back in her bag, left the moment undocumented, which was, for Jade, the highest thing she knew how to give, the decision that this one was already safe. That it didn't need to be preserved because it was already somewhere it wouldn't be lost. Darius looked at the table. All of them, the noise of them. The specific, warm, ordinary, irreplaceable fact of them. This family he had built out of whatever he had available, which had turned out to be enough, which had always been going to be enough, which he understood now in his chest rather than just in his mind. He picked up his slice, ate it, and for the first time in a very long time, that was the whole of what he needed to do.